inshallah. So I have uh, three guests, and they all have kind of varying backgrounds of expertise in this field. Dr. Farhan Abdulaziz is actually a physician. He's in the ER at a hospital in Dallas. And so he deals with things, we're going to talk about things from a type of, I would say, more physical perspective, medical perspective. Sheikh Suleiman Hani, you heard from earlier, has a more kind of spiritual approach. And Sister Sada, who is a certified counselor and therapist, who deals with a lot of people who are kind of dealing with varying issues of mental health. I thought I'd start with her. We had quite a lively conversation yesterday, because I think in your profession, you sometimes deal with people who are at the end of their rope, people who, they sometimes come to you when they've tried other things, but it hasn't worked. And I mentioned this yesterday, I'll mention it today as well, that I do personally see a therapist. I've seen a therapist for a few years now, and I find it to be very liberating to be able to speak to someone and not hold things back and be able to bounce things off people without really being judged. I think it's a very important thing for everyone to have that safe space. But still, it's a taboo, I think, for people to even get to that point where they might see someone like you. Why do you feel that might be the case still in our community?
Jazakallah khair for the question, first of all, but then also, like I said, we were in Minnesota for Anfest yesterday, and we had a discussion about this, and one thing that I really admire is when people are really upfront about the fact that they see a therapist. And what I said there was, I'm a therapist, I see a therapist, all my therapist friends see therapists. You need, as a therapist, within our master's programs, most PhD programs, for counseling and therapy require you to go through it yourself. And the reason is because it helps you to develop as a person, it helps you to release any blocks that you experience, and then also to practice what you preach. Here I am telling people that, this is something that can be life-changing, that can be beneficial, that can bring them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I'm not practicing what I preach, then do I really believe it, right? And it is a really beneficial experience. I think that within our community, there's still a stigma associated with it, because one of the ideas that people tend to have is, if my iman is high, then I don't experience any struggles, I don't experience any sadness, I don't experience any anxiety, because the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the prayer, reading Quran should cure me of that, right? And so when people then strive to seek help, they feel guilty and they feel like it's an indication that their iman is weak. And so to then tell people that they're talking to a therapist, they think they're going to view me as a bad Muslim, right? But when we look at the example of the righteous, subhanAllah, we look at the example of the prophets, right? Where even in the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's grief over the death of his son Ibrahim, he cried, and the companions turned to him and they said, oh Rasulullah, you're crying. It was almost like they were concerned, is this okay? We never thought it would be okay. And the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, the eyes shed tears, the heart feels grief, but the tongue only utters what's pleasing to Allah, right? And then through therapy, one of the things that people don't realize is that's exactly what we seek to do. We seek to become our best selves, and we seek to figure out a way to deal with our struggles, action-oriented, so that we don't utter anything that's displeasing to Allah, that we don't turn away from Allah, that we actually strengthen our iman through getting to know ourselves, inshallah. So to help alleviate that stigma.
Right, and I mentioned this yesterday, and I'll mention it again here. Not every imam is a therapist. I think in our community, we've often confused the two titles. People think because he studied Sharia and fiqh and hadith, that now all of a sudden he's a marriage counselor. That doesn't qualify someone to be able to really help people work through their own problems. And Sheikh Suleiman, you kind of gave it to the imams earlier in the day, and the masjid board members. I'm just rubbing it in. But you said something really important, and I think there is somewhat of a disconnect between oftentimes the management, oftentimes the musallin, and even sometimes in our own selves, this concept of religiosity versus spirituality. Some people feel as though, well, I pray the 5 daily prayers, I fast, I pay my zakat, but I don't feel anything inside. I don't have an actual sense of spirituality. Whereas other people might feel like, hey, I don't pray, I don't fast, I don't do the fara'id, but at the same time, I'm a good person, I feel good about myself, I feel like, Allah loves me. How can we balance those two concepts, being religious but also at the same time being spiritual?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, it depends on how we're defining spirituality. And so oftentimes people use labels, as we stated earlier in the lecture, and it can create a lot of controversy and misunderstandings if we are not defining things properly. So for a Muslim to say, for example, I'm a spiritual Muslim, but I don't pray. I'm good at heart and I feel spirituality, but I refuse to fulfill a certain obligation. We have to define spirituality and religiosity as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defines them for us. So I'll give you a very simple example, and this is very relevant because it's a realistic example. For those of you who know Dearborn, Michigan, you know how many Muslims and Arabs there are across the city. I walk into a cafe to pick up an order, and there are two people arguing, the man at the register and the one behind the register. And as they're arguing, I walk in to pick up my order, and unfortunately, a lot of people assume that if you have a beard, you're automatically a sheikh. So he said, Sheikh, can you answer this question for us? I'm like, I'm just here for my subs, I gotta go. They're like, quick question. I'm like, okay, go ahead. One of them says, I'm a spiritual Muslim, but I don't pray. I have good character. I feel things inside me, but I don't pray. So the reason I don't think it's that big of a deal is because I know people who pray and they don't feel anything inside, and I know people who pray who have really bad manners. And that's his justification for not praying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the understanding of religiosity, and here's the simplest way to understand it, and I will close with this. The combination of the words amanu wa amilu salihat in the Quran is found in more than 50 different contexts and occasions. For you to say, I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires action. And the action of good or bad is defined by Allah. So when Allah says subhanahu wa ta'ala that prayer is a prescription upon you, this is what is defined as religiosity. Now, of course, we have to cultivate our spirituality if we are translating spirituality as iman, or feeling something in one's heart, feeling some kind of hope, feeling connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You might be fulfilling your obligations and not feeling anything internally, but instead of moving backwards and saying, I don't need to do any of these things anyway, move forward towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by cultivating that spiritual aspect of Islam. We should not be excluding one for the other or pursuing one at the expense of the other. And so religiosity and spirituality, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to us as a prescription, is very comprehensive. It is for us to pursue the external deeds and also to pursue the internal spiritual cultivation. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakumullah khairan. And Dr. Farhan, actually, by the way, I mentioned to you earlier that I lost all my clothes today, right? I left my suitcase by accident at the checking counter. So this is actually Dr. Farhan's shirt that he lent me today. But just for the record, I think I wore it better, just because it looks really good on me, right? It looks like I bought it, but alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair, Shaykh. I have to thank you again. It does fit very nice. I might take it home. Let's see, inshallah. But yesterday, actually, we had a good discussion as well, partly because you work in the medical field, and people, I'm sure, come to you all the time with medical questions and queries, and I'm sure you've gotten it before. Somebody comes up to you and says, Dr. Farhan, I'm sick, I have jinn, something's wrong with me. You being in the medical field, what's your kind of first reaction to someone like that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the idea of jinn, sihr, magic, and the like, a very common idea within the Muslim community, and obviously it is real. Being possessed is real, and having magic upon you is real, but I think the overwhelming majority of cases, when I say overwhelming majority, I mean overwhelming majority, just anecdotally above 90%, are when somebody comes suspecting they have a jinn or they have magic upon them, it's actually a psychiatric condition. I remember seeing cases that I thought the person had a jinn. And I'm in the hospital, and the guy's like talking to people behind me, and he's like doing weird things, and I'm looking behind me, and I'm reading Ayatul Kursi, seeing if it makes a difference, and it didn't make a difference. But I think the overwhelming majority of cases are psychiatric conditions, and these are things that genetics plays a role, our environment plays a role, what we're exposed to plays a role, and also physiologically, there's a role for that as well. And different conditions aren't fully understood, but there's research going on, and we understand that there's certain chemicals in the brain that can get out of balance, and that can trigger a lot of these things that we see in terms of bipolar, schizophrenia, and depression, and the like. And so the first thing I would say to the person is, have you seen a specialist? And that's what I would strongly recommend, is seeing a specialist. Mental health is real. We're seeing cases of suicide in our communities more and more frequently, and a lot of people are having suicidal thoughts. There's places you can go to. There's resources that are available. Let me just share with you right now a website, just so if anybody's having these thoughts, you know where to go. sprc.org. It's a Suicide Prevention Resource Center. There's national hotlines. If you ever feel like you're on the edge and you're about to commit suicide, go to the ER, and they will get you somewhere where you can get some help. But definitely see a professional, a specialist before going anywhere else. I would say that.
That is a reality that I think that many of us have to live with, that people are sometimes at that state where they don't see any of their options. They could be dealing with many different forms of stress and anxiety. And I think resiliency is a very important topic at the same time, because especially amongst our youth, amongst our kids, I have a daughter and a son. My daughter's 5 years old, and I try to, anytime I can, build in her self-confidence. I want her to have self-love. I want her to feel confident in who she is, what she looks like, how she feels about herself. We want to have our kids grow up with that sense of resilience so that they can perhaps overcome the problems that come their way. Sister Sada, maybe you could elaborate more on resiliency as a tool to help combat preventatively some of these mental health conditions that we see many young people facing today.
Jazakallah khair. The concept of resilience, or some people call it grit, right? Meaning the ability to overcome struggles when they come your way and not to be debilitated by them. It's an attribute that we try to hone in ourselves, and ideally in our youth and our children. Like Brother Bona is saying, that it comes from a prevention-based angle. So instead of one of the earlier questions that you had asked me, Brother Bona, was, people come to you during like the most difficult times where they're just ready to give up and they're done. Ideally, we strive to get help before we reach that point, right? And so coming in from a wellness perspective, that, for example, just as a side note, I wanted to mention that a lot of times when I get clients that come into my office, especially, I'm not sure why for this particular reason, but especially for marriage counseling, they come in and they're just like, Sister Sada, if this doesn't work, we're getting a divorce. You're the last line of resource that we have. So if you don't fix us, then nothing is gonna work, right? Don't wait until that point, because it's a lot harder to come back from the edge than if you're, in the middle, right? And so that's what we try to do with our children. We come in from a wellness-based angle instead of from a prevention-based angle, instead of, okay, now that there's a problem, how do we deal with it? Okay, instead we ask, how do we prevent the problem? And one of the best ways to instill a sense of resilience, strength, grit in our children is based on our relationships with them and the relationships they have with other people in their lives, particularly adults that are really involved in their lives. And so somebody that I really admire once told me that our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very much like our relationship with people, especially our parents. Parents are termed early attachment figures for children. And that's how children develop their sense of the world and their sense of justice, their sense of love and respect and care, is based on how their parents treat them. And they transfer that mentality to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's just the way our brains are formatted, subhanAllah. So if a child can trust that their parent is going to be there, that their parent is going to show them love, that their parent is not going to be abusive, that their parent is going to look for the good that they do instead of harping on every single small mistake and ignoring every achievement that they've made, when they can see that their parent is focused in on the good, then they have faith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will focus in on that too. And so if they fall off of the path of Islam for a little while, they're a lot more likely to come back, because they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be loving and forgiving, because they've seen that their parents can be, right? So developing this sense of resilience in our children, I think, really starts, don't underestimate the impact that kind words, kind treatment can have toward our children, and the strength that they build within themselves and inshallah within their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, that's very deep, subhanAllah. Like sometimes I think as parents, we put so much pressure on our children. I remember my father was like that. My father's old school. You know, I would bring home a report card or a grade from school would be like 97%, and his first thing would be like, "Where's the other three? What happened to the other three?" Right? That's that. Sometimes our parents think they're motivating us, they're pushing us, but at the same time, you create like unrealistic expectations. You can't expect a person to be perfect all the time. Sheikh, I think nowadays there is becoming more of a trend towards people, even in the secular world, looking for a sense of spirituality, looking for some type of spiritual release. Yoga is becoming very popular. Meditation is something that a lot of people prescribe. Is there something, obviously, within our deen that we can look for in terms of a similar outlet, or are these, maybe Western trends something that we should be okay with, or even adopt in our own lives?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A few things. First, I would argue that yoga is not really a Western thing, although it manifested that way in recent years. For those who know, yoga is actually very close to Hinduism, and it plays a very significant role in their theology. But more importantly, I think the question that should be asked is Islam complete? And if we believe it's complete, then it provides, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides the avenues and the methods and the tools that we need to cultivate our spirituality. If we don't know them, or perhaps we are not practicing them properly, or we're looking for something to fill this void in our hearts, it's very easy to find a number of things that are very contemporary in the United States today. They're trendy today. They might not be trendy tomorrow. Whereas in our faith, there are a number of things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribed, and they're very explicit and they're very clear. And they are things that every one of us here has experienced in one way or another. And the question is really a matter of how we're implementing, a matter of consistency. One example of this is the Quran. Everyone has some kind of recitation of the Quran that really moves you. Perhaps even a specific clip. And at times I wonder, when someone says, "I don't have any Quran audio on my phone," how do you have all these apps and all these things on your phone and all these social media platforms, but you don't have a single recitation of the Quran that moves your heart? If you want the things that cultivate your spirituality, we should have quick access to these things. And oftentimes, one of the traps of the devil is to place between us and the Quran, between us and dua, between us and dhikr, a number of obstacles so that there isn't quick access. Whereas with the doors of sinfulness, or straying far from Allah, or feeling like our hearts are dead, it becomes very easy to access the things that are displeasing to Allah. And so the first thing I would say is turn to the Quran. And this is obviously my personal opinion, I cannot emphasize enough the theological belief that the Quran is a shifa for everything. The Quran is a cure for every type of illness in this world. And this does not mean that if somebody's struggling, for example, physically, that they should not take medication. That's not the statement here. But the Quran is a shifa for every type of illness in this world. And specifically, and most importantly, these spiritual illnesses. Many times when your body is going through symptoms, many people will perhaps rush to find some kind of solution or to understand what's happening to them. And at times people go online and mashallah, after looking on WebMD or Google, they've diagnosed themselves with something very severe and completely irrelevant to their situation. And the reality is, if you are in tune with your body and you really care about your body or your mind and your emotions and your mental state, to the extent that if you're suffering some symptom, you are going to and you should rush to find some kind of cure. Are we in tune with our hearts as well? Are we in tune with our spirituality? There are symptoms that your heart is feeling dead or hardened or distant from Allah, and Allah gives us all of the tools, quick access to these tools, any place, any time that you need. Amongst them is the Quran. This is not just random speech. These are the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why it's not surprising that it cures the heart. Listen to the Quran often. Reflect on what you're listening to. Another means of spiritual cultivation is to sit and face the Qibla and just reflect. Tadabbur and tafakkur is part of the injunction, instruction of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. Reflect on nature. Go out for a walk in nature. Reflect on the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another means of spiritual cultivation is dua and dhikr. Turn to Allah and pour your heart out in dua. Oh Allah, soften my heart. Some of you have heard of the scholar in recent times, Ibn Baz rahimahullah, who for a good number, perhaps an hour or two, a good length of time, was standing and making dua, and the students would enter to ask him a question, they would leave and come back and he's still making dua. So somebody asked, what was the dua? Allahumma aslih li qalbi. Oh Allah, rectify, purify my heart. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ told us that if your heart, your spirituality is cultivated and purified, then the rest of the body will follow, meaning your actions, your behaviors, your thoughts will follow. And so there are a number of these things that when you listen to them, when you hear them, when you engage with them, salah at night when nobody's watching, an act of kindness when no one is aware. We don't have to put it on social media. Hashtag, alhamdulillah, I'm super generous. Hashtag, Hunger Games just fasted. Hashtag, tahajjud all night. Why should people know? And so if you are cultivating a private, sincere relationship with Allah, it gives you a sweetness because of that love that you have for Allah that you cannot find in any material wealth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Jazakumullah khairan. We'll end with Dr. Farhan. Of course, again, being in the field of medicine, there is becoming a trend, I think, in medicine for people and doctors particularly to being prescribing, whether it be antidepressants, opioids is a big issue right now. People who are looking for pain alleviation, they're turning to drugs. And there might be some basis to it, but from your perspective and the trends that you see, how should we approach the issue of medication, drugs for mental health issues or otherwise?
Regarding the opioid specifically, I think probably you guys are all aware, if you've been watching the news, that there's an opioid epidemic. Overdoses, people dying or getting severely sick from overdose of opioids or drugs in general. Prescription drugs are also obviously used. I would say for anyone who is struggling with drug use or has thought about it, maybe your friends, or, people aware at school, just don't get close to it. I mean, there's so many times where I see young people in the ER who 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, and subhanAllah, they're young and healthy and they would have had an amazing full life ahead of them, and they're literally dying in front of me because of an overdose. And it's so sad. Or they've contracted an illness because they're shooting up IV heroin or IV fentanyl, and now they've got HIV and they got hepatitis C, and they come in every week to get their belly drained out of, or 10 liters of fluid from their belly that gets this big because they have liver failure. And we see all sorts of things, and it's just so sad. And sometimes I just think back, or alcoholics. They just can't stop, and their lives are destroyed. And I've seen Muslim patients come in, not just non-Muslims, in the ER. Alcoholics, their wife hates them. Their kids hate them. They've lost their family, they've lost their job, and it's just, they made a decision at one point in their life to go to it, and then they never turn back. So prevention is the best recommendation. Overseas, in European countries, they don't even treat fractures with opioids. You break your bone, you break your wrist, and you're getting a prescription for extra strength ibuprofen. You're not getting narcotics. And they do fine. But for us, we just have this obsession with narcotics, and people come into the ER making up all sorts of stories, putting themselves through all sorts of fake difficulties in front of me to get a buzz through an IV of meds that they want. And it's remarkable. I wish we had time. I could just share stories with you. Some funny, some not so funny. But that's regarding that. Now, with regarding to antidepressants or antipsychotics and the like, in general, I think there is more of a trend to overprescribing. Where little kids are being diagnosed with conditions that they're just little kids, But is there a role? Absolutely, there's a role, and that's why I said earlier, if you're having any of these issues, depression or having, if you're hearing voices, seeing things that other people aren't seeing, whatever it is, you definitely would recommend seeing a specialist, someone who's established in the field and who's good, and you very well may need medication. And I've seen so many patients who get better with medication. And if you're a Muslim, and you're spiritual, and you're praying your 5 times a day, and you're still feeling depressed, that can happen. It doesn't mean you're a bad Muslim because you have depression. So don't think that I'm a bad person. You could pray 5 times a day, do all those things that Sheikh Sulaiman just said. Those are very important, but you may still have some of those thoughts or some of those feelings. And so I strongly recommend seeing a specialist, and they can help guide you in terms of what medication might help you, and you could try it and see if it makes a difference for you. Allahu a'lam.
Jazakumullah khair. And to all 3 of our panelists, give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much for each one of you providing your input and a very important topic. Hopefully, inshallah, it will become less of a taboo. The more we talk about it, the more we open up, inshallah. May Allah help all those who are out there suffering, whatever capacity, inshallah.